Tes.
Tes. Alright. Yeah. Alright. Selamat malam pada kawan-kawan. Terima kasih kerana sudi hadir bagi acara kita pada malam ini. Yang berjudul Agenda for Sejarah Rakyat in Indonesia. Yang akan disampaikan oleh Profesor Jun Rusa dan dimudahcara oleh Imran Rashid. Mungkin pertama sekali saya ingin memperkenalkan diri. Saya Zikri Rahman dari Pusat Sejarah Rakyat, sebuah organisasi memfokuskan kepada sejarah rakyat di Malaysia dan Singapura. Jadi kami ada melakukan beberapa penyelidikan dan juga pengarkiban berkaitan dengan sejarah rakyat di kedua-dua buah negara. Dan pada hari ini juga kita cukup beruntung bersama dengan teman-teman Mandiri, sebuah organisasi anak muda yang memfokuskan kepada gerak kerja advokasi politik progresif di Malaysia. Dan rakan kerjasama yang ketiga adalah Under the Banana Tree. Mungkin ada teman-teman yang menerima zin ini. Ini merupakan salah satu terbitan yang dilakukan oleh kawan-kawan Under the Banana Tree, iaitu sebuah jaringan serantau memfokuskan kepada kerja-kerja pengarkiban di Asia Tenggara. Dan ya, tanpa membuang masa, mungkin saya sedikit konteks tentang syarahan pada malam ini. An agenda for sejarah rakyat in Indonesia. Seperti yang kita tahu, di kebanyakan negara juga mempunyai trajektori sejarah sosialnya yang tersendiri. Dan Indonesia juga mempunyai pengalaman yang cukup menarik untuk kita tekuni, khususnya dalam melihat seperti apa yang memberi kesan kepada pewacanaan sejarah rakyat. Bukan sekadar di Indonesia, tetapi juga di Malaysia dan juga rantau ini. Seperti yang kita tahu, sejarah kita banyak bergeser, misalnya dengan Cold War, Perang Dingin yang berlaku di rantau ini. Kemudian kita juga dapat melihat seperti apa proses dekolonisasi penjajahan yang berlaku di Malaysia yang juga memberi kesan kepada negara-negara lain. Itu satu. Dan kita cukup beruntung dapat bersama dengan pemudacara kita, saudara Imran Rashid, peneliti dan juga sekarang ketua eksekutif bagi Citizens International, sebuah organisasi yang memfokuskan kepada isu-isu global majority. Dan kita juga turut berbesar hati dapat bersama dengan Profesor John Rusa, seorang sejarawan yang berpangkalan di University British Columbia di Kanada, yang memfokuskan kepada sejarah moden Indonesia dan memfokuskan lagi kepada tema tentang apa yang berlaku pada tahun 65. Jadi beliau sudah menerbitkan 3 buah buku berkenaan dengan isu-isu itu, dan salah satunya adalah riwayat terkubur di dalam yang diterjemahkan ke dalam bahasa Indonesia yang baru diterbitkan mungkin 3 tahun yang lalu. Dan tanpa membuang masa, mungkin saya akan terus lanjutkan kepada Imran untuk membuka majlis. Dipersilakan.
Okay, terima kasih Zikri. Thank you very much for the introduction. I think Zikri has done all the introductions that I was supposed to do already. So you take half of my job is basically done. But first of all, before I begin, I mean, allow me to give a special shout out to a couple of things. One is, of course, Mandiri for organizing and for hosting this particular events in this wonderful space. I mean, as you know, that Mandiri has been active in doing all kind of things, public advocacy work, and this space has been a very historic space. It's a new space, yet it feels historic because these are where important meetings are being conducted, and at some point, I'm sure, in the next 10 years, one will look back and see that this will be part of the people's history in Malaysia as well. So, since I'm lucky to have Zikri to do a lot of my works already, I wouldn't want to repeat the same thing. So, I will pass it to John, but just to give us a sense of the flavor of this event, John will be giving us a lecture on agenda of Sejarah Rakyat Indonesia for about 40 to 45 minutes or so. And then we'll open up basically, well, not so much of a Q&A, I think. It's going to be a more like an open discussions, I think. Because I feel like we're quite lucky to have a very interesting group of people here who are also, I think, working on the Sejarah Rakyat sort of things in Malaysia. And I know that you are working in an artistic space, in activist space, and you are dabble with bringing up some memories of our history, especially from the perspective of the people themselves. So without further ado, I'll pass it to John to start the lecture, and then we'll start the ball rolling.
Yeah. Thank you, Zikri. Thank you, Imran. Thank you all for coming. This is a great honor for me to be able to be here in Kuala Lumpur. It reminds me of discussions that we used to hold in Jakarta every month about 25 years ago. Diskusi Bulan Purnama, and I look up and we're almost there. Almost there. So I've been working on Indonesian history for over 30 years, but I started intensively working on it 26 years ago, and I've been working with the Institute Sejarah Sosial Indonesia, and one of the people involved in that, who's the coordinator of it and director, is here, Ayurati, and so she will have some things to say as well. So I am not Indonesian, of course, I'm Canadian, but I have been going to Indonesia every year since the mid-1990s. And spending some years there as well, and been working with a lot of Indonesian historians and other researchers. And so what I'll talk about tonight is just some of the general things that we've been doing and some of the things that we're interested in. And so the emphasis should be on that indefinite article "an." This is an agenda. It's not the agenda, it's not the, it's definitely incomplete. It's sort of, I'm beginning with sort of the things that we're interested in. There's a lot of things we're interested in that I'm not going to be getting to, but I'll give you some of the reasons why we've been working the way that we have been working. Okay? So, oops. This term people's history is one that is kind of universal, right? For pretty much every country in the world, there's a people's history of that nation state. And saya baru tahu ada buku tentang people's history di Malaysia. So sebelumnya saya nggak tahu. I didn't realize that a book had been published. I need to read it. So there's a People's History of the United States that is one of the most popular books of history books in the United States. And there's of course, many different ways that one can do it. But there is always a danger when speaking about people's history. Is always, well, what people? Who are the people? And there's a tendency. Semestinya lebih keras. Should I speak closer to the mic? Or?
These are not government interventions.
I'm. Usually it's when the speaker is facing back this way, but it should be okay if it's facing out. Yeah. So I have a sort of low voice, and to save my voice, I prefer to speak quietly. So yesterday I was speaking for a long time, and I got a sore throat. So, okay. There's always a danger in people's history of populism, which gets kind of politically mushy, right? You're not necessarily looking at the specific concerns of the working class. You're sort of dissolving sectoral interests within a general population. And there's some advantages to that, but there can be some disadvantages as well. And we can talk more about it later. I want to focus more on what we've been doing in Indonesia. There's advantages and disadvantages too in this idea of history from below. Of course, we all kind of like it, right? We all like, we don't want great man history, we don't want elite history. But yet, at the same time, there's a lot of people from marginalized communities, from poor communities, who are really interested in knowing what the elite is doing and thinking and what they have done. And so sometimes, we need to be thinking about just a left history that covers everything, that is willing to cover both the elite and the people, the subalterns. And so I don't want to rule out history from above too, from an agenda for a left history. So I think in general, historians throughout the world, and no matter what country they're working in, if they have any idea of a left history, it's a concern for egalitarianism. It's a concern for looking at the way in which there are inequalities in a society and thinking about the ways in which those inequalities are justified. And they're often justified by history. And so history can play an important intervention in getting people to rethink a lot of what they take for granted and to say, well, actually, it doesn't have to be that way. And the people that you have been demonizing and discriminating against should be recognized as fellow humans. The importance of history is nowhere more clearer than when it comes to Israel and Palestine. And I'm quite thankful that I'm in a country which has demonstrated quite a lot of solidarity with the Palestinian cause. That the Palestinians today are the ones who, throughout the world, have been recognized as the people who are being demonized, and that demonization is being used as a justification for genocide. And that this is a very urgent issue for all of us around the world who are concerned about a more egalitarian world and a less violent world. And I think that's another theme as well in people's history, left history, history from below, is trying to think about how to create a less violent world, to deal with the incidences of violence that have taken place and trying to better understand them so that they can be avoided. It's a general theme. So, one of the tasks that the Institute Sejarah Sosial Indonesia has taken up is a kind of role of an informal commission of historical clarification when it comes to the events of 1965-66. Indonesia has not had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There have been no formal investigations except one that was from the Komnas Perempuan, the Commission for Human Rights for Women, or Commission Against Violence Against Women. Sorry, two against there. And that report came out in 2006. 2007, was it? 2008, and IU was one of the authors of that report. Komnas HAM, Komnas Perempuan was, it's an official government body, but in some sense it wasn't either. It kind of functions in this gray zone as an NGO and as a government body. But that report was presented to the president, and that's the one report that has some official status. And that was about the women who were victimized in 1965-66. But other than that, there hasn't been any, official discussions about what happened or anybody trying to clarify it. So starting in the year 2000, IU and I and other colleagues organized an oral history project to interview ex-tapo, ex-tahanan politik, from the time of 1965-66. And we spread out, people going to different parts of Indonesia, to Jawa Barat, Jawa Tengah, Jawa Timur, Bali, Sumatra, Kalimantan Timur, and interviewing ex-tapo and their families. And the first book that came out from that research, where we interviewed hundreds of people, was Tahun Yang Tak Pernah Berakhir, that came out in 2004. It's available to be downloaded for free if you want. I don't know if the typeface is all that clear in the back, but that's the first box there, is that title, Tahun Yang Tak Pernah Berakhir. And so that's about the experiences of the ex-tapo and their families. That's the focus of that research. And that's based upon our oral interviews. Yeah. The subtitle is Essay Sejarah Lisan. So the second book that came out of that research was just on this event of Gerakan 30 September. And I wrote this book, Pretext for Mass Murder. It came out in Indonesia as Dali Pembunuhan Massal. So that G30S was a very small-scale clandestine event about which there's been a lot of controversy. And I just used our oral interviews, but I used documents as well. So it wasn't entirely a work of oral history. In fact, I used a written document as sort of a key source. So that book was, not something I had planned to write when we were interviewing the political prisoners, because I thought it's sort of like the JFK assassination, it's like this small event, really. And there's all kinds of speculation about it. And but as I was working on it, learning more about the events and uncovering more documents, and had the chance to interview some people who were involved in it, I thought, okay, I'll write a book about it. And that did help, I think, many of the victims of the repression of 1965-66, because one of their key concerns was to be seen as good Indonesians. They were nationalists. They had been part of a sort of left-wing, pro-Sukarno, anti-imperialist movement, Bandung, solidarity, Asia-Africa solidarity. They had been part of, that first generation of nationalists. And they remained true to Indonesian nationalism, and they really did not like the fact that they were being treated as traitors. The museum that the government in... Maybe I can talk without the mic. That's okay. Oh, recording. Okay. So, the museum that the government set up in Jakarta to commemorate Gerakan 30 September is titled Pengkhianatan PKI, you know, and saying everybody who was involved with the PKI was a pengkhianat terhadap bangsa Indonesia. And that really is like the worst thing for these ex-doubles. And so the book, A Pretext for Mass Murder, was explaining that some of the top leaders of the PKI, IDIT, was involved in it. But everybody in the party, beyond the top leadership, had no idea about what was going on. So that meant a lot. And something I wasn't going to talk about, but just before, and speaking with Imran in the front room, there was something we did which I think was very important, which I might as well mention. The Indonesian translation of this book came out in 2009, came out 3 years after the English version. When it came out, the government banned it. And so the publisher, the Institut Sejarah Sosial Indonesia, brought the case to the Mahkamah Konstitusi, and the Mahkamah Konstitusi mengatakan bahwa undang-undang itu yang berada untuk pelarangan buku is unconstitutional. And so this was actually a landmark case that we were involved in, and IU was the lead petitioner for this case. So it removed the ability to of the Attorney General's office to unilaterally ban books. So that Indonesian translation became part of that case. It was decided in 2010. That was a kind of side project to our historical clarification work, right? But we did quite a bit of work on campaigning against book banning, okay? And then the third book is Buried Histories that Zikri showed earlier. So the pretext for mass murder is only about that one small-scale event, K-30S, whereas this third book is about the massacres themselves that occurred afterwards, and that's the big issue, right? And so I was trying to explain how these massacres were organized, and I won't go into the details about the conclusions and the methods and so forth, but it grew out of the oral histories that we did. So I used some written documents as well, but I also work on the histories of the victims. And going back to that issue of history from below, even though I'm bringing out the stories of the victims, people who also were not victims themselves, but who saw the massacres, who witnessed the massacres. There's stories of some of the perpetrators too. But my analysis is really about how the army took a decision to massacre prisoners. Okay, and that was the pattern. That's the main argument of the book, is that biasanya peristiwa ini dianggap sebagai pembunuhan massal. Itu istilah yang dipakai, pembunuhan massal. Menurut saya, peristiwa itu harus dinamakan penghilangan paksa. Yeah? This was forced disappearances on a massive scale. That was the pattern. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed in this way, in this particular way. And it's a very insidious, very nefarious kind of killing. where the family members don't even know whether their loved one is dead or alive. Yeah? There's no public announcement, there's no information given to the family members. People were put in prison, they were taken out of prison at night, trucked to desolate places, remote areas, and killed. That was the general pattern. There's a lot of variation, but that's the general pattern. And so a lot of the victims had no idea why the military did this, right? So part of what I'm trying to do is explaining what the military was thinking as to, and that required looking at the pattern across different provinces and how important it was, the decisions by military commanders, whether to kill prisoners or not. So that's a kind of qualification, I guess, to the history from below. It's sort of, a lot of the people who are, below in Indonesia, these former political prisoners, their families, the victims of the violence, have been left wondering, what the hell happened? Why did these government officials make these decisions? Okay. So these are some of the issues that we've been dealing with, and that's been our sort of general pattern, is experiences of the political prisoners who were held in prison without charge indefinitely starting in 1965. Most of them were released in the late 70s, but some were held all the way up into the late 90s. And then the September 30th movement, which was, okay, and then the massacres. Those have been the three sort of topics, the way we've organized it. So that's one task that we've seen as important. But after doing that, we were also thinking about, well, we're using the term korban. And a lot of these people that we interviewed were actually not all that happy with the term korban. And maybe in Bahasa Melayu as well, it has these connotations of passivity, defenselessness. And in some ways they were. But they also wanted to be recognized as good nationalists who had done a lot of good things before 1965. And so that history of the left movement in all of its forms before 1965 became an important issue for us as well. Okay? So there's a huge number of books about the party that were published at that time in the early 1960s, late 60s, 70s, into the 80s and 90s. There's books about the PKI. And the party itself published a lot. And so it seems like everything's open, there's nothing more to say. It seems like, yeah, we know a lot about the party. And it's amazing to see how, if you compare the PKI with any other party in Indonesia, it was the PKI that was publishing. None of the other parties published. PNI, Masumi, NU, they didn't publish their own kind of propaganda, their own party line, explaining policy. The PKI was publishing a daily newspaper, it was publishing pamphlets all the time, it published a theoretical journal. It was, the leaders were giving lectures all the time and publishing the lectures. So, but there's actually still a lot to think about, to know more about when it comes to the history of the PKI. And one of the things is the daily kind of activism of people and the day-to-day activism, the day-to-day life of the party. That has not been covered well in the existing literature. And the party's publications tended to focus on their policies, not on what was, sort of the experience of ordinary people involved with the party in some way or another. Okay. So that is something that we've been more concerned about. There's also an issue of how the PKI was part of a cultural movement. And if you want to understand something about how culture can be part of a political movement, the story of the PKI is really important. In fact, there's hardly been a left movement in the world that has done as much as explicitly thinking about culture as the PKI. So one of the organizations that had an affiliation to the PKI was LECRA, and there is quite a lot that's been written about LECRA. And our group, Institute Sejarah Sosial Indonesia, helped put out this film. The information that we had was used by some filmmakers that we were working with. I wasn't involved in this film at all. There was other people. Ayu was involved, and other researchers from our group were involved in this. And you can watch it on YouTube. The title refers to the address of the headquarters. You can see in the back, LECRA. And itu motor brong. In Indonesia, do you use that word here to brong? No? Brong, motor brong. He has to change his knalpot. The fellow in the sunglasses is Wee Hai Jun, whose property, who owned this building, and he was a representative of the PKI in Parliament. And he was deeply involved in LECRA and the activities of LECRA. And this happened to be when a visiting writer from Eastern Europe, I forget which country, is standing next to him there. The other people are writers and artists. And then next to Wee Hai Jun is his wife, Jane. And in 1965, this building was dirampas. It was expropriated, confiscated by the military, and became the property of some military officer. That's another important side of the story of the repression in 1965, is just the mass looting of property by the military. And this was sort of prime real estate in downtown Jakarta. So the film is about the sort of day-to-day activities of LECRA and gives more depth to our understanding of what it was doing, apart from, like the formulations of policy. Some of the more personal stories as well. Wee Hai Jun, I'll mention too, was the translator for Capital, Capital Volume 1 by Karl Marx. Later on in his life, he translated the whole thing in his own style of Bahasa Indonesia. And, he was a prolific translator of Marxist works as well. He was a political prisoner for 14 years on Pulau Buru. So his wife, Jane, preserved a set of photographs he had collected a lot, he had taken a lot of photographs. He had a camera, he was taking a lot of photographs of party activities, of Lekra, from the late 50s up to 1965. And a lot of party members who had photographs burned the photographs so that those could not be used as evidence. And so there are very few photographs that have been preserved from the families of the victims. Jane fought hard to preserve those photographs. The house that they had been living in, not the Jalan Chidorian house, but a different house, the military tried to take it over, but she refused to leave. And they wound up compromising where she occupied half the house and some military family occupied the other house, the other half. And under that kind of environment, most people would have just burned the photographs, and she refused to. She kept all of them, the negatives and so forth. So one of the activities of Institut Sejarah Sosial Indonesia has been to digitize these photographs and collect the information about them. And so some of the photographs are on the website of Institut Sejarah Sosial Indonesia. We're still working on it. We've digitized a whole set of negatives that are not on the website. But that's one of the things that we've been doing and trying to, again, it gets back to this idea of understanding day-to-day activities of people involved in the party. One of the themes that we have is to, personalize these issues. A lot of times even in left histories, we get more organizational histories. And we see, we use these big collective nouns like the PKI, the army, the Socialist Party, the Partai Nasionalis Indonesia, United States. We tend to use these abstract nouns. And what one of our principles has been, because we interviewed so many people, we have a lot of personal stories, and so we're always trying to write from a personal angle. And so if you look, you've read the introduction, right, of Riwayat Terkubur, and you'll notice in the first page, the first 3 pages are about a personal story. Yeah? And I try to personalize this as much as possible. Name names, give people characteristics, make it so that the reader understands that this is all these big abstract things about, Perang Dingin and perlawanan PKI terhadap tentara dan segala macam. All those kind of big picture things mean something in people's lives. And so we're trying to personalize it as much as possible. But there is a theoretical point here, which is not really so much personal stories, but it's something I'm writing this summer. I'm trying to finish by the fall. So probably some of you know about Gramsci and this idea of the importance of culture within a struggle for hegemony over a civil society. He's an Italian communist, imprisoned by the fascists. His prison notebooks became kind of world famous in the 1970s and 80s. But the PKI is never talked about in relationship to Gramsci. And they didn't know Gramsci at all. They never read his stuff. But what they were doing was actually very much a Gramscian thing. And the first chapter of Riwayat Terkubur discusses that in a basic way, and so I'm going to elaborate on that. And that's more sort of an issue of sort of Marxist theory, but trying to explain how the PKI operated and how all these people, especially in the West, who've been really concerned about Gramsci, but have never thought about how what the PKI did was a Gramscian strategy, and a very effective one. But still, in the end, they wound up getting killed. So, anyway, any kind of left struggle for state power inevitably entails issues of coercion. And Gramscians tend not to deal with that part. Okay. So another issue that is of concern to me now, something that I'm working on, is on the constitutional history. And again, this is kind of expanding what it means, to, what people's history means. So Indonesia had a constitutional assembly that met from 1956 to 1959. Popularly elected delegates, they were elected in 1955, met hundreds of times in Bandung trying to come up with a new constitution. There was a provisional one, a temporary one, Undang-Undang Sementara of 1950. And so they were going to revise it, and the whole idea was this is going to be a sort of post-colonial constitution. This is going to express our independence as an Indonesian people. You know? And they wound up not agreeing on it, and President Sukarno disbanded the assembly and reinstated the 1945 constitution. And so from 1959 up until the late 1990s, until Suharto fell in 1998, Indonesia's constitution had almost no rights recognized. So Indonesians lived under a constitution where they had very few rights recognized in the constitution. So I want to revisit that story. Why did this constitutional assembly, the Constituante, why did it fail? And just since a lot of you are probably familiar with the Bandung Conference of 1955, I'll mention that the Constitutional Assembly met in the same building. But if you go to that building now, the only discussions or only exhibits there are about the Bandung Conference of 1955. There's nothing about the Constitutional Assembly. But this is how it looked inside the building at the time the Constitutional Assembly was meeting. And that was Sukarno in the left there addressing it. And so this was there's one book on it written by a guy who was very much against Sukarno and very much against the PKI. And it's a heavily biased book, I think. And so I wanted to write something different about it. So just for the sake of, in case you're curious, you know about the Bandung Conference of 1955, that building had been a social club used by the Dutch, and it was a European-only club for cocktails and dance parties and concerts. And then, so that's up until 1942. And then in 1955, so just in a matter of 13 years, it goes from being a European-only, kind of whites-only club to being the center of a global, Asia-Africa, I shouldn't say global, but an Asia-Africa conference with global significance. And this is Sukarno just disbanding the Constitutional Assembly in 1959 and reinstating the 45 Constitution. And I think this is a tragedy. I think this was a really unfortunate event. And I wanted to write about the importance of rights for social movements. I think it's, left movements always need to be thinking about laws, and usually they do. But in this case, the Communist Party, for kind of understandable reasons, agreed with this move in 1959. In retrospect, I think that was a mistake. So I am trying to reevaluate this period of guided democracy in 1959 to 1965, and to reemphasize this idea of, constitutional rights are not, they can always be violated. But I think it's better to have constitutional rights than none at all. If you're going to have a state, I think it's best to have a constitution that has laws that can limit state power and make it more transparent. So that's one of the things that I'm working on now. But a general concern that the Institute Sejarah Rakyat has had is on the revolution. And this is a very different experience than Malaysia's experience. So the Institute Sejarah Rakyat Indonesia has been really concerned about the whole history of social movements in the 20th century in Indonesia. And what happened at this period, 45 to 49, is really crucial. Because in 1945, in mid-August 1945, when Japan surrendered, in Indonesia, there was a complete vacuum of power. And the Dutch had not returned. The British were also late to come in. And the British, at the time of the proclamation of independence on August 17th, had not yet come. And so power was up for grabs. And it was a real kind of common consciousness amongst Indonesians that they were embarking on a new society. And all of those hierarchies that they had been living with came under question. It wasn't just, okay, we're Indonesians against the Dutch. It's not just that. It's within Indonesia itself. Who are these, I'm just talking about Indonesia now. Who are the Rajas and Sultans? What are their powers, right? In Sumatra Utara, there was a revolution in which about 100 of the hereditary elite were killed in early 1946. And this became a burning issue. It's like, whoa, why is this guy boss? So for all kinds of social relationships at this period, there was a lot of questioning about, and those hierarchies had to be justified in new ways if they were to continue. So that state collapse, I think, is really crucial. In Indonesian historiography, this period is always called the Indonesian Revolution, which is misleading because when it began, the leaders of this so-called revolution were not thinking about revolution, and they wanted to avoid using the term revolution. They wanted to gain they wanted to be in the good graces of the United States, and they wanted to appear as just, we're ordinary people trying to set up a state. Please recognize us. We're not troublemakers. We're not subversives. We're definitely not communists. We're not revolutionaries. But somewhere along the way, in about 1947 or 48, even Sukarno started using this term revolution in his speeches as a kind of recognition that there was this general social ferment. But there was always this tension between people who were just trying to create a new state and people who were trying to create a more egalitarian society. And Sukarno and Hatta were not really recognized as the leaders. They weren't automatically recognized as the leaders by all Indonesians. And they had to, they had to position themselves if they were going to remain leaders, and they had to reorient themselves as revolutionaries if they were going to lead this group of people who had become much more radical in their perspectives. And so the Indonesian, or what I'm just getting at, is how important this period is to study. And it hasn't been a direct study by everybody in the Institute, but one of our colleagues, Razif, has written quite a bit about workers at this time. This is a picture that was taken in Yogyakarta in early 1948 by an American photographer, but it appeared in a Dutch publication. And these are women soldiers walking down the street. And this is, not something you would have seen before the revolution. So this is a kind of symbol of what was happening in the revolution, where there wasn't a clear state. State power was not clearly defined, and a lot of people were taking liberties. So there was a lot of openness. So one of the issues is a kind of Gramscian issue, is the question of hegemony. During the time of the revolution, workers were taking over, and this is something that our colleague Razif, as well as this historian Jafar Surya Mangolo, has written about. They were just the railway workers. After August 1945, they just started managing the railways by themselves. And there was negotiations then on how they would work with the nationalists. And in general, the workers tended to see the nationalist leaders, Sukarno and Hatta, as the leaders of the nation. And so they were willing to sort of accommodate them. They were willing to work with them. But there were, peasants were occupying plantation land. Plantation agriculture was massive in Indonesia, as it was here. And without that kind of state structure, a coercive force, workers just started taking over the land and cultivating it themselves and saying, this is my property. And they would organize sort of their own militias to protect the land that they had occupied. So these are the kinds of things that are happening in the late 1940s. But they had to, it wasn't, these actions were not being led by people who were completely opposed to Sukarno and Hatta. And so that kind of dynamic between this nationalist leadership and the other activists and the more radical movements for social revolution remains an ongoing issue of great importance for any kind of left history, history from below, people's history. The PKI itself viewed this period as all-important, and they would call themselves sort of the party of the August Revolution. And they would say that the August Revolution had not yet been fulfilled. And that's a big part of their literature. And actually, quite a bit of the scholarly literature on the PKI doesn't deal with this part of how important the August Revolution that didn't happen was for the PKI. They considered themselves sort of anak Revolusi Agustus. They were sort of the product of this upsurge. So that's a key issue for the PKI, so in fulfilling the promise of that August 1945 revolution. They would call it a revolution. Yeah. So, yeah, that's a... another thing is, how much time do I have? About 10 minutes. Okay. So another important issue is, I'm sort of working back now. So I didn't organize this I organized it in reverse chronological order. The Japanese occupation is still an important issue, and I'm not quite sure what the status of the literature is on that here in Malaysia. But for Indonesia, there's some big issues that are still unresolved. There's this one economist who has said that 2 million people died of famine in Java in 1944, 1945. And he's done this on the basis of statistics. But nobody else is sure that that actually happened. I mean, did 2 million people die or not? I mean, you would think that would be easy enough to answer, but the information that we have is so skimpy, that it's actually still an open question. I tend to think that it's not possible. No doubt some people died, and everybody was very poor by 1945, and a lot of people were malnourished, but I don't think it happened in that scale. And then the story about the Romusha, the forced laborers, there's very little information that we have about it. The Indonesian government after independence really didn't want people to talk about it. Sukarno himself and Hatta and many others had collaborated with the Japanese. And they just said, yeah, let's just put it behind us. Let's work towards the future. But we have very few stories from the forced laborers themselves. And so that remains an issue, I think, that we need to address. And so the story about the comfort women as well, there has been little research done on that, and much more work needs to be done there. The social movements before the Japanese occupation, again, these remain sort of difficult to understand for us now, the way in which Islam functioned as a mobilizing force for Syarikat Islam that began in 1912, and how that influenced the rest of the nationalist movement. The Indos, the Eurasians, the mixed race people, played an important role too at this time in the 19-teens and 20s and 30s. Their activities and the way in which people were trying to both embrace and get away from the colonial categories. So the Dutch worked with these categories of the native, the inlander, the foreign Orientals, meaning Chinese and Arabs, and then Europeans. And the question was always whether natives would organize as natives, or whether they would say, look, we're not natives. Promotia's novels, which you might have read, deal with this issue of kind of the confusion of the inlander, the natives, about how to organize, and the question of identity, the question of a collective identity that could serve as an identity to fight against colonialism. So the importance of workers during this time as well. Unions were important in especially Java and the railways in the early 1900s onward. There's an important book by a fellow who has worked with us in the past, Andi Akhtian, called Ras, Klas, Bangsa, Politik Pergerakan Anti-Kolonial di Surabaya Abad ke-20. And it especially focuses on this nationalist leader, Dr. Sutomo, but it's dealing with all these, again, it's kind of intersectional, and this is the kind of analysis I think we need more of, is an intersectional analysis dealing with race, class, bangsa. Sutomo was a doctor, he was an elite member, but yet he was part of study groups that included many other classes. And he was a sort of nodal point for a variety of classes. And this is, gets back to this idea of elite and low, working class or, marginalized people's history. Andy is trying to show how even this elite history was involved in a much more broader social movement. Women's movements are also important. This is, there's some literature about this. It tends to focus on organizations and the toko, like Kartini, and much more work needs to be done on that, and IU is doing work on that, and again, personalizing these histories, getting away just from organizational histories, and trying to get at everyday experiences. Again, for women's movements, the revolutionary period, 1945 to 49, was crucial. Finally, this is just my last slide, okay? But I'm really surprised that very few of you have fallen asleep yet. My voice is kind of soothing. IU always falls asleep. She fell, but she's heard some of this before, so it's not kind of understandable. And it's been a long day. But if I did see some of you falling asleep, I would have raised my voice or stood up and done something crazy. And so we have a certain idea of what left means over the past decades. And I think we have to do a lot of reevaluation of that, given the nature of capitalism today, and given the kind of ecological crisis that we face with global warming. And, we need to be thinking about how left movements have not dealt with that very well, and have also not, there's a lot of exceptions, but the PKI, for instance, tended to be all about economic growth, and industrialization, and, and thinking about the Soviet Union as a model, or China as a model. And I think, we can't do that anymore. And one of the things we can do is rethink common property resources, the way in which societies that were treated as backward and primitive and uncivilized were actually, how those people are our future. That we have to think more about how to live with fewer fossil fuels. We have to change our relationship with the environment, with nature. Degrowth strategies, I think, are important. And just rethinking this whole idea of what economic development means. And the left, I don't think, has always done that well. It's often thought more about redistribution rather than just, redesigning the whole society. Of course, there are exceptions, but that is certainly an issue that we need to be dealing now with, just global warming and the kind of dystopia in international politics that we face now with the kind of gangsterism of Trump and so many big tech corporations, and a kind of collapse of international law too. The Board of Peace that was approved by the UN Security Council, I think, is kind of marks the death of international law, and it's going to be really difficult to revive it. But I think at this very time, it opens up the possibility for complete reorganization of society, and we have to be sort of as radical as this situation presents itself to us. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, John, for your lecture. How's everybody doing? Look, I personally doesn't find it. I mean, your voice are very soothing, that's for sure. But the topics that you brought up in your lectures are very intriguing. Partly because I think one of the main things that I've learned from your presentation is how people's history can manifest in various themes and aspects of the past that are quite crucial as well for us to understand. And I think you were quite right to mention that the people's history are one of the ways of writing history. It's not trying to replace or provide the way of writing history. And the writing of histories from the people's perspective, interestingly enough, it tells you the personal histories of the people themselves. But one thing that I quite like of your presentation is how their stories are not done in isolation of other things that's happening around history as well. Their stories can inform you about the military history, the elite history as well. And because people themselves, they are not living isolated from other things that's happening around them, right? So I mean, okay, that's from me. I wanted to open up the floor for Q&A. Well, not exactly Q&A. I'm quite happy to receive any sort of reactions as well. Or sharing as well. I mean, feel free to express yourself. So the way it's going to work is I'm going to maybe pick up 2 or 3 sort of reactions as well as questions, if you have any, from the floor. And then once we have that, we'll pass it back to John to sort of provide some response, and then we'll go on until we conclude it at somewhat possibly around 10:15, 10:20. So let me open the floor. Anybody wanted to sort of provide some response or questions? Okay, one over here, one at the back. Okay, let's start with you. I'll pass you the mic.
First of all, thank you very much for the talk. Your voice was very soothing to listen to, but it was so engaging. My eyes were open the entire time. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Kansa. Aku sebenarnya dari Indonesia sendiri, saya dari Jakarta. Dan saya sedang belajar di Kuala Lumpur sini. Dan I actually did my bachelor's thesis on 1965. It was a bachelor's thesis, so it was very rudimentary. But your book on the pretext for mass murder was actually one of the sources I had used. So I was very excited to listen to your talk today, so thank you very much. I think one of the interesting things about history from below, Sejarah Rakyat, is the sort of, it can really change your perspective on a sort of official narrative. For example, the PKI in Indonesia was very much seen as the boogeyman, especially for my generation and my mother's generation before that. But I really felt that effect when I was talking to some of my elders from my own family. For example, I had two very different experiences from 2 different sides of the family. One of them was living in Ponorogo, East Java. They had told me a story about, they were actually party members of the Muhammadiyah at the time. And they were telling me about why they had a personal hatred for the PKI. And they had the story about their house being burned down. He was a pretty prominent figure of the party, a local chapter, but his house was burned down, and he said it was a sort of turf war between the Muhammadiyas and the PKI. That's why they had a very strong hatred. But timeline-wise, they don't really remember when that happened. This was a passed-down story. So I was trying to fit it in the timeline. When could this have possibly happened that made sense? What is in 1942? Was it after 1945? Was it before 1965? But this was the main reason why they had held on to this hatred for so long. But another contrasting story was a family member I had from Semarang, which was in central Java. They had said that the PKI, where they had lived, was quite a neutral presence in their village. They were just one of the many parties who were doing grassroots efforts in that village, I would say. And they had told, this was a story from my grandmother's brother. He said, oh, the PKI were actually just, people didn't really see them in anything bad or anything. But when the massacres had started, moving forward, my grandfather told me about how the PKI had actually gave little banners that the villagers can hang up on like their house or to show that they had allegiance to PKI, but they didn't really know anything about communism or they didn't really understand anything about communist ideology. They had probably felt affiliation for the PKI because of their grassroots initiatives for labor movements, etc., etc. But because they had that little sign, suddenly they had woken up and their neighbors were gone. They just disappeared. And so that's how he personally remembered it going in Semarang. So it just painted two very different pictures about how PKI's presence in these little villages. And when I was doing my bachelor's thesis about, PKI had did this, they were very involved in, the Comintern, blah, 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 blah. I just painted very different pictures of the party. And that's something that I had really piqued my interest in why, what's it called? Oral histories are so important. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, my name is Muklis. I'm studying UM. I just say thank you to sir because this lecture is quite interesting about the history of itself. Even they never mentioned about the PRI and Pemesta because I know during the call it the Indonesian Revolution, there's a lot of factors regarding internal conflicts, like outside of the Java Islands, especially in Sumatra, and also I heard about the Sulawesi also. Maybe I try to ask the question because this regarding about the G30S. What kind of factor the PKI try to use the chance or what call it Dewan General. And that time, they said they want to create another revolution to take care the Suharto reign, especially by the presidential. Plus also, is it they have another motivation because during I think before DNI did take over PKI, there's another happening regarding PKI. Is it mean the conflict in Madiun? Is it DNI did use that chance to create another revolution to create Indonesian communism in Indonesia? That's it for me.
Let me see if there's more questions for this round. We'll have more. Okay, Pangu. By the way, I mean, for those who wanted to ask questions, if you feel free to ask your questions in English or Malay. I'll try my best to. Yeah, and John, Malay.
Terima kasih. Terima kasih. How do you see the film Jagal? It's obviously it always shows the emotional quotient available at that point in time, as well as the strategy of weaponizing the Preman to do the work, to do the dirty work of the elites, yeah? And that's one thing. Secondly, in relation to the question raised by the second person just now, I think PRRI happened in the late 50s, yeah? In the late 50s, and maybe there's a question of centrifugal relationships, yeah? Center and the periphery, yeah? If you could comment a little bit on that. And then finally, how do you explain that obviously we can present it and we can listen to it in a very somewhat detached manner, but how do you explain that things that happen on that level cannot be resolved even after 5 or 6 decades? And is it only a question of ideology, or is it also a question about the ambition and power? Thank you.
Okay, John, I'll pass it to you to respond, and then we'll have another round afterwards.
Okay, so thank you so much for these questions, and I'll try to cover them all. One thing to remember about official narratives is that they are often inconsistent. And even when a state is trying to be consistent and to have like this one narrative that covers everything and answers all the questions and everyone needs to accept it, usually that narrative is full of holes and internal inconsistencies. And with the Suharto regime, there's actually multiple official narratives, and they give different answers at different times when it came to what happened in 1965. You're familiar with the phrase that victors write history. Victors also forget history. They also just don't write history. In Indonesia's case, they did not write history. They decided not to say anything about the killings, the penghilangan paksa. So they kept quiet on that. And that's what made the film Jagal so important, was that here was a perpetrator who was speaking out. And there are very few perpetrators who actually came out after 1965 and said, ya, saya yang jadi pembunuh, ini caranya, bagaimana saya membunuh orang. They didn't do that. They knew that what they did was meant to be secret. If you look at Jagal, how he took people, he did not kill them on the street in public. I wrote an essay about this idea of the open secret, right? Since you've seen the film, you can visualize it, where people were taken to that office in Medan, the Pemuda Pancasila office. And so people sort of knew, okay, these people were going to be killed, but the killing was not done in public. And it was done anonymously, and so it wasn't clear who did the killing and who was being killed. And then the corpses were just disappeared, dumped over a bridge into the Kali, atau sungai. So the perpetrators knew at the time this was kind of a clandestine thing. And here you have Anwar Congo saying, actually, I want to be proud of what I did. And the other Pelaku are saying, no, don't. Joshua Oppenheimer interviewed about 40 people like Anwar Congo in and around Medan. And it was only Anwar Congo who was willing to make a film with him. The others knew that, no, this is not something you make a film about. So, yeah, this is, here's this huge event, hundreds of thousands of people killed, and yet we know very little about it. And one of the reasons we don't know about it is because the people who knew something about it, the killers, didn't really come out and say, this is what happened. They were not encouraged to do that, and so forth. But the other thing was that a lot of people were really confused. And I think the stories of your family members reflect that confusion. Because I don't know how to modulate my voice, whether to be quiet. It was meant to be confusing, right? People are being abducted, being held in prison, and then disappearing. So, people would see signs, like a truck going past with a bunch of people, and then the truck's coming back empty. But they couldn't say, well, what exactly happened? Maybe they were just transferred to a different prison. I don't, people were fundamentally confused. So if when you have great hopes of oral history to go, interview people and that's going to clarify matters, it often doesn't in this case, because people will give you these stories and they're still trying to make sense of what happened, and they can't. So it's only if you are able to interview a lot of different people and cross-check the stories and really dig deep. And one of the things that needs to be, dug further is, again, the personalization. In your stories that you recounted, it was all about the PKI. Here's Ponorogo. Kalau ada PKI di Ponorogo, itu berarti ada orang, mungkin namanya Joko atau Bambang atau apa. Dialah anggota PKI, dia tinggal di sana. You need to push people on, not allow them just to say the PKI. So, persisnya siapa? If you, who did you know who was in the PKI? And what exactly did they do? And so avoiding these big nouns, I think, is one way of helping people clarify their memories, Because a lot of times when they talk about the PKI, they're often influenced by the films that they saw, the Suharto regime just made such a mess of Indonesian history, inventing stories and creating whole absurd myths about events. And, we haven't dedicated a lot of time to debunking all of these stories because it really would take a lifetime. And, we debunk some of them. So there was questions about PRD, Perdamesta, and this is important because Malaysia played a part in that, and, as did Singapore and Taiwan, and the US, of course. I didn't mention it in my discussion about the ending of the Constitutional Assembly, but that was actually a key factor. External subversion. For the US, this was just a small-scale operation that they did. It didn't turn out well. Alan Pope was shot down. The CIA aid was discovered. But for Indonesia at the time, it induced panic. Yeah? Banyak orang Indonesia merasa waktu itu bahwa memang negara kita ini labil. Ini pemerintah ini bisa digulingkan oleh antek asing. So they began thinking, we need a strong state. And discussions about human rights, constitutional rights, itu, kita nggak ada waktu untuk soal-soal itu. So Sukarno's, that's why I was saying that sort of in retrospect, you can kind of understand what they were doing. But they were trying a shortcut to creating a strong state and wound up creating an even weaker state. But thanks to Malaysia, Indonesian democracy was sabotaged. Of course, I'm exaggerating. It wasn't just Malaysia. I was surprised in the records. A lot of information has come out. The CIA documents have come out. State Department documents have come out. Historians have been looking at Republic of China's documents. There's some new scholarship on that. Taiwan's own documents have come out about it. And I was surprised just how deeply involved Taiwan was in this. But it had terrible effects on Indonesian politics. So, orang PRRI di Sumatra membunuh orang PKI waktu itu. And they did it in the same way as they did it in 1965. They had taken PKI people as prisoner when they began the action, and then when they started losing, they just killed their prisoners. And that was one of the reasons why the PKI really wanted to back Sukarno. They wanted protection from Sukarno. One of the reasons they supported guided democracy. So, you asked a question about what was the PKI thinking at the time of, actually the PKI leadership, IDIT, thinking about Gerakan 30 September. What was the goal? And here I think it was purely defensive. IDIT waktu itu merasa bahwa memang ada Dewan Jenderal, ada jenderal-jenderal kanan yang bekerja sama Amerika dan CIA, dan mereka mau menggulingkan Sukarno. Untuk mencegah kelompok itu, harus ada gerakan 30 September. The decision that the discussion that the Politburo had, and this is based on secondhand information. There were PKI leaders who did talk to other people later about it, sort of in confidence. But we know that this much. The decision was, hit first or wait to be hit. And there were advantages and disadvantages, and there were debates about it. And they finally decided, well, kita harus pukul mereka dulu. Kita harus mendahului tindakan mereka. So that became the... that was just the top leadership, and they thought that it was just a military action. It wasn't. They didn't involve the party in it, and IDIT thought that these military officers would take care of things themselves, and the military officers thought that the party would take care of things. That was the article, and that was the argument in pretext. Okay. And so nobody was in charge of the operation. It wound up failing. But the plan for IDIT was these military officers would stop. It's a putsch. It wasn't a coup. It was to protect Sukarno. And then they thought, later the PKI could grow after that. But it wasn't directly for a revolution at all. I mean, that was one of the myths of the Suharto regime, that G30S itu berarti pemberontakan PKI. Itu bukan pemberontakan. It's a putsch. it's a minor action against a few generals, seven generals. There was a question too about how come this can't, how this can't be resolved, yeah? And I think part of the problem is just the continued power of the military within the state. And we saw this in 2016. There were some reformers who organized a national symposium in Jakarta to have a discussion. And they said, look, it's a long time ago, kita bangsa besar, kita bisa membuktikan bahwa kita, Indonesia adalah bangsa besar yang bisa menyelesaikan masalah kita sendiri. And it was a very noble-minded symposium. And then the reaction from the right wing, which really came from the military, was hysterical, and they just shut it down. And they prevented any further discussion. And President Jokowi was really scared about encouraging any further discussion about it. So,
Maybe you can elaborate a bit. How does the military is present in the whole power relation of Indonesia?
yeah. So the military in Indonesia has a territorial command, and so it's kind of a unique thing in the world. I don't know of any other country that has this. I discuss it in the first chapter of Riwayat Tukubur, the origins of this territorial command. So you have a civil administration, right? You have the governor of a province. You have the mayor of the big cities. You have the bupatis of the kabupaten. You have the camat, kecamatan, and then you have the desa. The army has a parallel administration that shadows the civil administration. And they keep quiet. And if you're in Indonesia, you don't automatically see it, because they don't do a lot of things. They don't do a lot of things visibly, although it's not secret either by any means. They have big buildings in the center of towns and cities. And every village has an active duty army personnel, usually a private or corporal. Every village. Sometimes it's a group of villages if it's kind of remote. And what does that guy do there? He just monitors what's going on. And one of the key things that he monitors is whether anybody's saying anything about 1965. Because they're continued to be told that these communists are organizing. They never die. There's ada specter, the classic specter. Ini bahaya laten. Right? That's the slogan of the military, Bahaya Laten. And they say that, they still believe it. They have to believe it. That's their sort of principle by which they go by. And so if students organize a discussion about Jagal or about some other, if I was invited to speak and the title of the lecture was something about 1965, they would stop it. Right? This Dutch historian writing about Tan Malaka about 10 years ago was on a book tour. He wrote 6 volumes on Tan Malaka, right? It's just incredible. Harry Puza. It was a bit too much, really. A lot of detail. And so he was on a book tour, and everywhere he went, the army, it's the territorial command. These people would just come to the university and say, no, this is not happening. And they can operate this way outside the law, that they set their own laws. Right? They're not accountable to anybody. And so that's, the lowest is Babinsa, and then at the top is the Kodam. The Kodam is the Kodam. It's for covering a whole province. So about a third or a fourth of the Indonesian military, active duty military personnel, are functioning in Indonesian society just as a kind of supra police force, and they're completely unaccountable, and they try not to make themselves controversial. You know, they don't want to get people to criticize them, but one of the things they do is just sort of that's what how they were initially set up, was to be anti-communist, to stop the PKI, and that has just continued to today. And they really prevent any kind of rational discussion about what happened.
Right, okay, let's go for another last round before we conclude. Anybody else from the floor, audience space, wanted to ask? Okay, one.
Sorry.
Hello, my name is Suhaiza. Okay, I just have one question. We cannot deny that PKI also in other perspective can be as a major non-state in that construct that how that Indonesia is in international system, and especially in Southeast Asia now, you know. And Indonesia also as a largest Islamic state, PKI also be as another factor that construct that how Indonesia identity, is it as a federal state or Islamic state or maybe as a communist state. And yeah, we know that Indonesia choose to be in the middle, not black, not white, tidak keras, tidak terlalu lembut. You mean that it's tengah-tengah lah. So how that PKI as a major non-state actor in that era, end of the day bring as Indonesia nation building now, you know. That is my question. What is your opinion to nation building and also to the PKI? Thank you very much.
Anybody else? I have a lot of questions on my end, but I'm saving it because I wanted to give the chance for others to ask. But if you are not interested in asking question for now, let me use this opportunity to ask a couple of questions. I mean, you're taking my opportunities now.
If it's taking yours, then I'm fine. Hello. First off, thank you for the talk. Very soothing voice and I think it was very interesting to see how the official narrative often has a lot of loopholes, and how a people's history or social history attempts to challenge that. You mentioned at the start that there is an issue with Sejarah Rakyat, where sometimes the accounts can become too populist. And on the other hand as well, I think especially with some of the historical research done before a social history became popular, there is this sort of presumed objectivity of the historian that also ends up reproducing a dominant narrative as well. So in your personal research or like in your methodological approach, how do you sort of balance between those two things? And I guess in a way it's also, in a way parallels also that balancing between sort of mentioning abstract actors like the PKI or the PKI, and also going more personal into mentioning the actual sort of actors within that history. Yep, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to ask questions as well before the whole thing concluded. So I have two simple questions. I think one is, I think a lot of your works are focusing on the 1965 tragedy and the massacre that took place in Indonesia, right? And I was wondering, I mean, as you go through the sort of collections of oral histories and data, and based on those data, how do you assess the impact of the generational trauma that comes from that particular episode of history? Because, and especially how you mentioned as well earlier that those episodes of history are not widely discussed, are not officially discussed, and there are barely a lot of discussions that are allowed in the public spaces about this topic. And what are the sort of generational trauma that you've seen from the assessments of your data collections, right? And the second thing is, I think the agenda of people's history of Indonesia, one of the operative word here is Indonesia, a national category. I was wondering, as you go through the whole process of collecting, synthesizing, analyzing the people's history of Indonesia, how much of that anecdotes challenge the very national category itself that are being used as a framework to understand the history that are taking place in those era. So, yeah.
Okay. Pertanyaan pertama, saya kira kita harus lihat PKI sebagai produk dari revolusi Indonesia, sebagai akibat dari revolusi Indonesia itu sendiri. So the PKI became popular in the 1950s, not as a communist movement, but as a nationalist movement. And it embodied, it was a populist movement. It embraced populism. The subject of the revolution was the Rakyat Indonesia. And pimpinan-pimpinan PKI sudah membuktikan bahwa mereka orang yang setia kepada rakyat Indonesia, kepada bangsa Indonesia waktu zaman revolusi. Sehingga banyak dari mereka jadi pahlawan, dianggap sebagai pahlawan di desa, di kota, di provinsi. So PKI jadi populer karena memang there's a reason, there's a reason they're popular, and they had a lot of there'd been poor people's movements, nationalist movements, working class movements since the 19-teens that had popularized a kind of equality. Sama rasa, sama rata. Itu slogannya orang-orang PKI. Yeah? And so that responds to something in the society. Yeah? And also the early years of the PKI was when they were with Syarikat Islam. And they had an interpretation of Islam that was a left interpretation. And one of the chapters of Riwayat Kubur membahas soal itu di daerah Surakarta di Jawa Tengah. Ada orang-orang yang kayak kiai, yang ulama, yang melihat Islam sebagai agama yang bisa mempersatukan orang untuk melawan ketidakadilan. Yeah. So they emphasize the role of Islam in fighting oppression and injustice. Nah, waktu itu, tahun 20-an, 30-an, banyak orang PKI di Jawa itu percaya bahwa ini sesuai dengan ajaran Islam. Yeah. So after the revolution, that Islamic character to the PKI decreased because everybody was emphasizing, bangsa Indonesia. The Islamic part didn't become important. But they never, up until 1965, they never denigrated Islam. They never insulted Islam. Many of the members were Muslim. Their principle was always, religion is a private matter. The party doesn't involve itself in it. At the Constitutional Assembly, one of the representatives of the PKI was an Islamic scholar, and he condemned Muhammadiyah and the other Islamic groups and saying, you're not Muslim. You just accept money from rich people and talk about Islam that yang sesuai dengan kepentingan orang kaya. You don't protect the poor. Yeah? So they made a distinction between the sort of elite, kind of bourgeois version of Islam and their version. But they were never. It became a standard myth after 1965 that the PKI was anti-Islamic. The propaganda film that the Suharto regime came out with, the first scene, itu adegan pertama itu tentang bagaimana salah satu kelompok PKI menyerang masjid, salah satu masjid di Jawa Timur. And it didn't happen that way at all, you know. It's just they just made that stuff up. There was a tension between PKI and Islamic organizations, but it wasn't anything like what so dramatic, so simplistic as came out later. So the PKI was beloved by Sukarno precisely because they had mobilized so many people who were Muslim, you know, to be patriotic to Indonesia. So anyway, so they did play a role in a very large role in nation building. And their main enemy really wasn't the Islamic organizations. It was the right-wing military who were working for the United States. Okay. So there's a question about objectivity, and so I've tried to write these books in a way that is fair, and actually this pretext for mass murder has not received a lot of negative press from the right wing in Indonesia. And a lot of people have read it and thought, well, this is actually helpful in kind of helping us to understand, you know, the sources, how to read the sources, what happened, and so forth. And the fact that I acknowledge that ID had a role in it is enough to make them happy. I didn't want to make them happy, but and if they read further, they would know they should not be happy with that, you know. So, but at the same time, you know, there's actually the two books, Pretext for Mass Murder and Buried Histories, are very different in tone. The Pretext for Mass Murder was meant to be a kind of detective story, and it was very dispassionate. Whereas Riwayat Terkubur, because I'm speaking about, you know, these atrocities that are really just unnecessary, terrible atrocities. You know, kalau ada penghilangan paksa, itu tidak bisa dibenarkan. There's no excuse for it. There's no justification for that. And it's outrageous, you know. And so I wanted to express that outrage, and I wanted to express the sadness. When I was writing this book, Riwayat Terkubur, there are many passages where I was crying, and I wanted the reader to cry too. And I don't think I lost any objectivity in that. I think that itu wajar saja. Ya. Kita manusia, kita bukan binatang. So actually, I mean, some animals don't respond when other animals are killed, but anyway, some do. As to the intergenerational trauma, you don't want to. I think it's been a really long day for both you and I. So the trauma is a loaded word, and it's been difficult for us to deal with it. So in sense of how to use it, because trauma in one sense literally is when a person cannot gain any distance from the past, where the past is present, and where the sort of feelings of that time remain just as strong as they were at that time. When we were interviewing people about, 35, 40 years after the event. And by that time, they had sort of dealt with their issues. And they were able to gain a distance from the past, by and large. It doesn't. In saying that, I don't mean to say that they were dispassionate at all, but I hesitate to use the word trauma, right? It was. I mean, in some ways, it was traumatic. It just depends on how you define trauma, and it's yeah. People had very different kinds of experiences, and one way that the victims dealt with their suffering was to not tell their children about it, right? And so when we interviewed a lot of people, we would interview them in the front room, and their family members would say, "We never heard anything about this before," you know? And they didn't want to they wanted their children just to get along with the neighbors, and they didn't want to create any problems for the kids. A lot of family members of the victims were employees of the state, and the state had rules about how you couldn't be related to somebody who was a victim. And you could get fired. And so family members would tell the ex-tapo or ex-anggota PKI, kamu diam aja, kamu di rumah, jangan macam-macam. It was family members who would suppress it in the end, and the ex-tapos, and they knew that they didn't want to cause problems for the other family members too, and so a lot of them kept quiet. And it's and that is a kind of suffering in and of itself. A lot of them have been so active before, and one way that they've been dealing with that, we could call it trauma, is by finding ways of just getting out of the house and meeting old friends. And there's a women's choir that was formed by some of the ex-tapos that Ayu has been writing about. And they're sort of appearing kind of non-political, but still just to get out and be active. I would say the national category, the national framework for this story is crucial. I have been criticized actually for ignoring the United States, the role of the United States. Actually, or not ignoring it, but just not writing, not emphasizing it. And partly there was just a kind of division of labor where there were other historians who were writing about this. Have any of you seen the book Jakarta Method? Yeah. Okay. I see some nods. That came out the same year as the Buried Histories did. And that is more about the U.S. and how the U.S. used mass disappearances around the world, encouraging other states to do that. What Chile did, what Argentina did, was an attempt to replay the quote-unquote success of Indonesia, a permanent elimination. So there is that side of the story. It's just because I was working with these oral interviews and sort of the Indonesian side of the story, and that had not been discussed. I figure other historians who work with English language documents, biar mereka yang urus itu, and so I'll focus more on the Indonesian side of things. Yeah.
I think this, we'll conclude here, I think, because we are nearing 10:30 already. Let me just say first and foremost, thank you very much, John, you as well, for being here. It's a wonderful session, very informative. And thank you for the organizers as well for hosting this, Pusat Sejarah Rakyat, Mandiri, and Banarchi. And thank you everyone for coming here and with your questions as well. So I think I'll just conclude here. Again, there's a lot of things that I think one can learn from the sessions, and I think the book that you've written, you can find them in Gerak Budaya, some of them. I'm sure it's there. And I think the documentary that you discussed earlier was, well, it's in English, The Act of Killing. You can find them on YouTube as well. Please do. It's a tragic, very eerie documentary that speaks about the Sagal dan Senyap. Yeah, the other one is, what is it in English? The Act of Silence. Yeah. The Look of Silence, sorry. The Act of Killing and The Look of Silence. Okay. With that note, thank you very much again. I mean, please drive carefully once you go back. Thank you, John, and thank you, Ayu, and let's conclude here. Oh, okay, sorry. It's a usual thing where at the end of the sessions we'll have a bit of a photo sessions. Please stay for here for a bit. There will be a photographer somewhere. Yeah, I saw a cat passing by earlier, and I suspect that could be an SB. Yeah. Nowadays you can't really tell, right? So they are all possibly trained cat. So the photos are coming from the top, is it? Oh. Okay. So that's okay. Let me just invite Matt to pass the cenderamata to our distinguished speaker today. These are from Mandiri. Gambar. Photo. This is all people's history.
Maybe not the table.